Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, and I've been doing a series of videos Ask Me Anything about writing. I've got a couple of questions here today from Royal Dreams 888. How much quality work and talented artists are rejected, and then the labels, I assume it means publishers, beat their heads against the wall when someone else releases them and makes money from them? Who actually determines what's good and what's not? And then second question, what would you recommend to aspiring artists who want to publish something but are afraid of what others might think of them? Do you still have those feelings, or is it no longer a part of you? Can you give some tips and advice? How many hours does it take to write a book? It seems like you've been publishing a lot lately. How do you do it? Okay, so number of things there. They're separate in certain respects, but related. Let's start with the simpler, the logistical one first. How many hours does it take to write a book? Of course, the answer is it depends. Obviously, it varies by author. I know some authors who take a year or two over each book, and some who produce 3, 4, more a year. It kind of depends on what you're trying to produce and how you are publishing. For me, I shoot these days to do maybe 2 books a year. That's fairly ambitious. Yeah, which is fair. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I've actually managed to maintain that. I think, I have a couple of different series in process. Some of them I'm completely in charge of. I'm effectively the sole author, like the Hideki Smith books, though I consult with my family on those. And I'm working on something now, which is just me. And then there are other books that I do as part of my ongoing work with Tom DeLonge of Blink-182. We have a book coming out later this year, which has just been announced. I'll talk about it in more detail later. It's called Time Rider, and it comes out in October. And I was working on that from the tail end of 2023 through and initially there was a lot of plotting and outlining and figuring out what the larger story is. And then I did the first draft in the spring and very early summer. I think I was done by maybe June. So, over the space of maybe 5 months, I was actually writing the first draft. And then I got feedback from Tom and his people and did another draft. And then we got the developmental editor involved and did another draft, which was fairly substantial. There was some stuff that needed addressing, and the book got significantly longer as well in the process. And by the end of the year, we were into sort of small edits, which spilled over into the beginning of this year. It's now summer 2025. So, that book spanned, I would say, maybe 15 months in the actual development of it. The drafting, the actual sort of writing of the first version, which is in some ways the hardest and most important part, took about, I'm thinking 5 months, but that was because I had some other things going on at the same time. I would normally expect to do it a little faster. I've said this before, but generally speaking, if I know what I'm doing, I used to say I would shoot for 3,000 words a day. Now I think I shoot for a little less, maybe 2,000 words a day or 2,500. And that shift is because I'm now retired as an academic, which means that I have more writing days and a little less pressure on me to produce in between classes, in between rehearsal projects and so on. So I would say that, usually I can do the first draft of a novel in about 2 months if I know what I'm doing. And usually that it helps if I have some kind of outline in order to get on track and stay on track. And then how long the editorial process takes kind of depends on the nature of the publisher, or whether I'm working with other people, or whether it's just me or what. At some point, it's going to go through some sort of editorial process. And hopefully it's not a big developmental edit, and you get to sort of the small stuff fairly quickly. So your active amount of work on a book might be, I don't know, 6 months. But, it can spread out. I often find that I can start writing the next book in first draft form while I'm still working on edits for something that has already been turned in. But I can't draft new projects simultaneously. I need to be able to focus on one thing at a time. So that's the sort of how long does it take you to do it part of the question. And then the question about, am I afraid that people will not like what I do or make fun of what I do? I've been doing this a long time. I guess at this point, I don't think so. I think I write what I want to write. I don't really care that much what people think. And partly it helps because I write lots of different things. If people are unimpressed by my science fiction stuff, I might point them towards a different kind of story, which has a different weight to it, a different tonal quality. Maybe they'll like that. Maybe they'll respect that. Maybe they'll respect my work as a Shakespeare professor. I mean, that for me is one of the things, that I do very different stuff. A lot of my academic colleagues are not going to read my fiction, and vice versa. Most of the people almost none of the people who simply read my fiction are going to read my academic work. It's not intended for them. It's a completely different thing. Are there people who are going to despise anything I produce? Yeah, sure. But, okay, I mean, you cannot let those people stop you. I always say, don't try to write to impress other people unless you have somebody very specific in mind. Write mostly for yourself. Write the kind of books that you want to write. And I think that if you do that, you have faith in what it is that you're doing. And as the question sort of implies, this goes beyond books. This includes making music or making art, visual art, or anything along those lines. I think, you have to start by doing it for yourself and then find if there's an audience for it. I think people who sit down to try and appeal to a specific audience are maybe more interested in selling their stuff than they are in artistic creation. That might be an oversimplification, but I would be wary of it. I think you should create first because you think it's cool or interesting or powerful, right? If you're in a particular emotional place and you want to make a song about it or write a book about it or a poem or whatever, I think that there's an organic authenticity to that impulse. And sometimes it's really helpful to simply not care, to not think about how this is going to sell, what people, whether they like your stuff or not, are going to think of it. Make it first and then decide what you want to do with it. You can write a book and then not publish it. Or you can write a book and then retool it for publication, right? What's much, much harder is doing it the other way around, trying to sort of shape your work to the market. I generally think that's a bad idea. And in publishing, as I have said before, publishing moves so slowly that by the time you have finished the book and got the book out in the public, the trend that you were chasing has often turned into something else and gone away, and your book looks derivative and old-fashioned. So I would say stick to your guns, write the stuff that you want to write, and then share it with people and see what they think. Maybe they'll have, the kinds of suggestions or criticisms or skepticisms that will make you see it in a slightly different way and say, okay, yeah, I need to rethink this, I need to retool this in some way. But yeah, if you're intimidated by what you think other people might think, you will never produce anything. And of course, if you do publish, you don't have to publish it under your own name. You don't have to advertise the fact that you're the one who made it. Use a pen name. If you're that worried about it, if you're working in a job, your career could be affected by people having a negative association with the kind of books that you're writing or the songs that you're singing or something, then maybe don't announce it. You can have a secret career if you want, by putting stuff under another name. This comes back to the question of who decides what's good and how much stuff gets rejected, which is then successful. So I think that the The trick here is making a distinction between what's good and what sells. Some publishers, particularly if you're working in literary fiction, right? The kind of very either highbrow or delicately structured or issue-driven kind of serious literature that's going to be, on the Booker Prize list or the Nobel or the Pulitzer or whatever. If you're producing stuff like that, then publishers might have an eye simply to quality, by which I mean forgetting all concerns about market and what people might think of it, and just assessing it in terms of, is this, a powerful story that uses language really well and it's evocative in terms of character and issues. And for that kind of book, I think, it is possible that a publisher will think simply in terms of quote unquote quality. But I think that's less common than it used to be, and it applies to much smaller numbers of books than it used to. And a lot of literary fiction does not sell particularly well if it's not getting the Pulitzer and the Nobel and the Booker Prize and so on. And that raises the question of how badly publishers want to get the sort of respectability kudos of publishing serious literature. They would, for the most part, prefer to sell books that actually sell really well. And this has become even more true as the profit margins in publishing have got steadily smaller, and many of the people controlling publishing groups are finally not particularly interested in books per se. They're interested in product and they're interested in money. A lot of the traditional publishers are no longer their own entities. They are now part of multinational conglomerations run by effectively the sort of hedge fund manager types and business people who are simply, making money off product. They're not interested in whether your book gets really, really well reviewed. They're more interested in your book selling in large numbers. And as I say, this is a different issue. You can write a lot of books that will have an audience, even if they are not particularly great. For me, the sweet spot is to write books that are dynamic and interesting and compelling and work within existing genres that are entertaining and fun, but also moving and rich and powerful. And I believe that those two things can go together. It's not necessarily what the general reader wants. Most general readers are looking to be entertained. And some of the biggest selling books are not what you would call great quality literature, but they do well. And I think, as I say, most publishers would probably take that over simple quality. This is sort of a false binary, but you take my point, right? So does a lot of stuff get passed over by publishers or labels or whatever and then does well? Sure. Because publishers are looking for big hits, but they don't always know. In fact, they never really know exactly what that big hit looks like. And as I've said before, what that means is frequently they look to publish things that look kind of like stuff that is currently doing well, right? Which is one of the reasons that so much of the publishing industry feels so derivative, so that, a book does well and then there's thousands, or it seems like thousands, certainly dozens, even hundreds of similar books with similar titles and similar covers that are all trying to jump on that same bandwagon. So yes, books that have the potential to do really well often get ignored by publishers, and then maybe another publisher picks it up and it does really well. And then everybody's like, oh, I can't believe we didn't get that. And I could tell you plenty of stories of authors bumping into editors at major houses in elevators or whatever. And the editor says, oh, I loved your such and such a book, and I'm so glad that it's doing really well for you. I really wish you'd brought it to us. And the author says, I did. You rejected it. You personally rejected it. And of course, the editor doesn't remember because it's only become a thing after it has been successful, which is maybe 2 years after it was submitted to them. So this does happen all the time. And it goes back to that question of the difference between quality and marketability. And sometimes you have to figure out what it is that you're trying to do. I said I'm working on something right now, and I have no idea what the marketability of this book is, but it's a book that I want to write. And I'm doing it for myself because it contains things that I'm interested in, and I'm working on it, and I'm going to write it, and I'll submit it to my agent, and we'll go from there. I have no idea. I'm hoping to be done with it by maybe the end of the year, maybe earlier. We'll see. So, the short answer to the question about quality, as I have also said before, the quality of your work is the only thing you can control. There's so much luck and randomness in this business. And I don't just mean publishing. I mean in the whole art world, including music, right? There's so much luck and arbitrariness. Things take off because somebody finds it and they like it, There's other stories of Tom Clancy suddenly taking off because there was a photograph of Ronald Reagan and he was standing in the Oval Office and there was a copy of a Tom Clancy book on his desk. And suddenly this became the thing that launched Tom Clancy. I mean, it's just bizarre. It's random, Now, in those circumstances, the book has to be at least competent, I think. But we can all think of books that are far better than similar books that have done much better. Name recognition, word of mouth, bestseller lists, prominent reviews, these things all make a huge difference. None of those are within an author's control. So the only thing that you can do is make your work as good as it can be. And I would always say, don't worry about what other people think. Do the work, make it really good, and then decide what you want to do with it. This happens a lot less than it used to, but I think there's value sometimes to saying for a young author to write a short story or a novel and then take a step back from it, show it to people, and have people say, this demonstrates your talent, but the book itself is not ready. Maybe write something else and then come back to this. In art, and particularly in literature, it's a marathon and not a sprint. You're trying to produce stuff that you're going to be doing for years, and there's no rush. If your stuff is not ready yet, don't publish it. It can actually hurt you. So, yes, write what you want to write. Make it as good as you can possibly make it. Don't worry what other people think. That's my answer. All right, that's it. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my books. You shouldn't be taking advice from me unless you think that I can write. Check out my Patreon page. My patrons see these videos first, and their support keeps this channel in operation. Check out my little Dashery store for shirts and mugs and stuff like that. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.